welcome, dear colleagues and friends. Of course, first I'd like to thank to the organizers of the event, the High Commissioner and the Chairmanship, for this opportunity to be here today with you and to briefly share the overview of the role of the OSCE as a regional organization, actually the biggest regional organization under Chapter 8 of the United Nations Charter, and to give you overview when it comes to our youth policy support. As such organization, of course, we are supporting regional implementation of the global youth peace and security agenda, and we place particular emphasis on youth protection, on promotion of youth participation in different areas. We heard about some of them already, such as education, tolerance, non-discrimination, political participation, of course, prevention and countering of violent extremism, etc. And our participating states, 57 of them, have repeatedly recognized the contribution of youth to enhancing peace and security by adopting more than 50 ministerial declarations and decisions which are recognizing the role of youth in contributing to peace, security, and cooperation. Of course, the list is much longer if we go beyond education area. Also, last year, our Ministerial Council adopted the Declaration on the role of youth in contributing to peace and security efforts, which takes note of the landmark Resolution 2250 of the Security Council and the following one, 2419, which created additional momentum for the OSCE to work on this topic to strengthen our own capacities in this regard and recognizing the role of youth in youth peace and security. And the chairmanship, of course, this year recognizes in particular importance of youth mainstreaming across our structures, and this is something that I would like to particularly emphasize. Youth mainstreaming is basically a cornerstone of meaningful youth participation, which in return strongly enables effective conflict prevention efforts and peace building, which is based on intrinsic motivation, first of all, sense of belonging, and then solidarity within communities. Basically, if I am a young person who is living in a society where I got opportunities for proper education, employment based on meritocracy, where I have a feeling that my voice matters something, that I'm motivated to participate in elections, for instance, etc., then there are greater chances that tomorrow I will be, well, already today, actually, active citizen who feels even responsibility to bring back something to the community because it's my community. I'm not detached from it. From another side of view, of course, if I as a young person do not have this kind of enabling environment, then of course there are greater chances that I might slide into certain destructive behaviors, feel detached from the community, and of course do not feel any sort of responsibility to invest further in prosperity of that same society if I feel that my own very existence is not recognized, that my opinion is not appreciated, that I do not participate in any possible way in decision-making processes. So I believe that youth mainstreaming is precisely about that, about opening the path for the meaningful youth participation, which then in return can really contribute also to conflict prevention efforts, but moreover to development of societies when we use full potential of the huge population that lives there. In the OSCE region, for instance, 38% of youth are 30 years old or younger than that. In this vein, the OSCE mission to Serbia has embarked upon developing a comprehensive approach to youth mainstreaming as both strategic and operational method. We heard this term multiple times today, and this is very encouraging that is more and more recognized in these circles and beyond. But unfortunately, this practice is not widely practiced, let's say, or this is done more ad hoc or depending on different circumstances. Of course, there are examples of good practice coming from some of the UN agencies, such as UNESCO, actually, then the World Bank, Commonwealth Secretariat. But just to give you a small indicator of how much more we all still need to learn on how this is done is just if you try to Google youth mainstreaming approaches and how this is done, basically there is going to be less than 1 page of results on the topic. So this is just a small indicator how much more we still need to work on that, because all the resolutions such as 2250 are globally solidly recognized and we all agree about the principles. There are still multiple obstacles that we need to overcome. I would like to mention only 3 of them today. First is the lack of know-how, meaning that inclusion, it's not only about counting heads or creating only youth youth-only events, and after that we might or might not take up of some of their recommendations in some policy-making process. Then there is limited capacity building opportunities for both young people to become equipped to actually contribute to sometimes very complex processes in this regard, but on the other hand, of stakeholders to meaningfully involve them in these processes beyond decoration and tokenism. And finally, very resilient obstacle that we still have is ongoing prejudices which are discrediting youth as active agents of change and equal partners. Basically, we do not put them often enough at the same table with decision makers. And let me just remind that not many young people are decision makers globally. Basically, I believe that in average we have maybe 2 to 4% of MPs across parliaments which are younger than 30 years old. On the other side, these prejudices we can also see in programming, which comes from the angle of prevention of destructive behaviors rather than systematically relying on youth as agents of positive change. For all of these reasons, the mission to Serbia intends to further invest in youth mainstreaming as a strategic and operational method, and we hope to have wide multiplier effect in this regard, recognizing that our own infrastructure should first be open and enabling for a proper youth mainstreaming. For the first time, at least in our context, one practical framework will contain the full package, from guidelines, capacity building, training courses, programming across all the stages of project cycle management, establishing internal consultancy processes, also external advisory body as a permanent mechanism, and of course relying on existing examples of good practice throughout the OSCE and beyond. Basically, such approach should be applied in every given policy. In diverse societies, policies in field of be it education, participation, language, or any other field sustaining conflict prevention efforts, youth mainstreaming should be applied fully if we want to see sustainable democracy and peace. Now I would like to mention just a few examples which are very concrete from our work, but I hope they are demonstrating the overall principle on how we can create more quality work with and for youth toward their integration. In the OSCE mission to Serbia, for instance, we prioritize regional connections between young people. And in the area of peace building, we are enabling intercultural learning among them, for instance, from people coming from societies where there is evidence-based social distance present. For instance, we have a project, Humans of Albania and Serbia. And yes, the title is inspired by the famous Humans of New York, so I'm happy to be able to mention that exactly here today. This project gathered youth representatives from 2 countries around joint skills development, joint creation of initiatives, building on their advantages as digital natives, which place them in a position of active agents whose voice is heard and whose ideas are being supported. I would like to recommend you to take a look at the short documentary which is available online on YouTube in English. It's called Kismet, on the particular role of young women in this regard. Then another example is about investing in capacity building of youth organizations, meaning organized youth, to participate in the work on human rights treaty bodies. So, for instance, we are trying to doing this by equipping young people to monitor and report then about youth rights in the UN. And youth rights as a concept, of course, is not still well developed or accepted, let's say, so something to be worked on. And when it comes to the policy making on national level, this was somewhat mentioned before, that we need to reach out to young people who are not only coming from elites, let's say, from the leading universities, studying probably political sciences, living in capital cities, and so on and so forth, but also, and of course, inclusion requires a bit of investment and resources, but we need to reach to other people who perhaps are not as prone to contribute to policy-making processes such as national youth strategies creation, because they are not going to go to the website and give comments. They maybe don't even know that this is possible. Maybe they don't know or don't want to use the formal language that is required, but that doesn't mean that they don't have opinions and solutions to different areas which are tackling their everyday life. So the example that we try to do is to partner up with the Ministry of Youth and Sports a couple of years ago, when the National Youth Strategy was created for the next 10 years. and try to deploy the methodology which will help in reaching out different young people who are maybe not even studying, living in rural areas, maybe do not come from youth organizations, and then to enrich the chapter on security, which is today in the National Youth Strategy. Which leads me to the fourth point, which is about the diversity, that we always must keep in mind that youth are not a homogeneous group. Meaning that we need to work with others, as I said, not only university students, top students, and very smart people. In this regard, who are maybe easily accessible, and maybe sometimes it's easier also for us to reach them. In this regard, the mission works also with subgroups of youth, for instance, with young media makers, with young politicians, with young Roma and other minorities, but also with juvenile inmates, and we work with others. We had for a long time an educational course for others on how to work with vulnerable youth. In this regard, it is also very important to partner up with state institutions and stakeholders in general, such as that we work on youth mainstreaming with the National Minority Councils, but also youth participation with the Commissioner for Protection of Equality. And the final point is that we always have to keep in mind, again, the prejudice that young people maybe can contribute only to certain obvious areas, and to some others maybe not so much, because they are either do not have enough knowledge, or these are very, let's say, very serious topics for young people, such as hard security, for instance, or economics and that kind of thing. But it is not impossible. For instance, in the anti-corruption programs, we have reached around 500 students through the project Corruption Through the Eyes of Youth, and in another initiative of that sort, we worked to teach young students how to monitor anti-corruption trials. So involving youth in a cross-cutting manner is, of course, not an easy task, and it requires resources, but the benefits we can see back from investing such resources are much bigger. For instance, I would like to mention for the end the example of how this is done in this particular context here in the UN when it comes to Agenda 2030, that the Serbia, for instance, had the voluntary national review, which is very, very, very youth mainstreamed. Every chapter of the SDG has a youth perspective, as well as the look towards the future, where they contain youth messages and very concrete recommendations. So I wish we don't talk about that examples as exceptions, but rather as a new norm, as a new standard we can hope for tomorrow. Finally, when it comes to my main message is that proper participation leads to proper integration, and this is a precondition for sustainable democracy in peace. Stakeholders from global and national level can strive for this vision through cooperation and sharing of knowledge and experiences. For instance, the Progress Study on Youth Peace and Security is recommending establishment of youth peace and security focal points on national and regional levels, and this can be one of the ways for exchange. Speaking from the OSCE experience, we do have a network of the youth focal points, and this was very effective in serving such purpose for our organization. It was just a snapshot of what we do in the OSCE when it comes to youth. I will be very happy to share further our model also on youth mainstreaming, and thank you for your attention.
I think it is telling that the two participants who received an applause after their intervention are our youth representatives. Of course, we very much value the involvement of all the participants, but I think what we hear, and absolutely, but I think what we hear is, of course, the experience, but also the passion of the voice of the young representatives among us, and that's, I think, a very enriching and very important for all of us to hear.